So hello everyone and welcome to the session on think tanks and democratic changes. My name is Sonja Stojanovic Gajic. I'm an independent researcher and organizational consultant working on security issues, conflict issues, and EU affairs. In my previous lives, I've led a transformation of the organization called Belgrade Center for Security Policy from an NGO into a think tank focusing on scrutiny of the work of security institutions, so police, military, intelligence services, and so on, and checking if they're working in line with democracy and how security policies function, whether they contribute to democracy or not. I have more than 2 decades of, almost 3 decades of experience in civil society, and I tried to capture it for the last On Think Tank's annual review in an article on reverse circle of change in the Western Balkans. And I guess I'm invited also not because of the experience from the Western Balkans, but because I worked in other regions in post-Soviet space, in Egypt, Palestine, and partially with colleagues from Latin Africa, especially on issues how civil society can open up the discussion on security issues. And today I'll be your host with my partner from Chile, Ignacio Irarrázaval, who I'll call to introduce himself before we start the discussion. I hope you guys have a coffee or wine and are ready for a good discussion on a difficult topic, but also with some good recommendations of movies. So Ignacio, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's Ignacio Irarrázaval. I'm director of the Center of Public Policy at Catholic University of Chile, and I worked previously at the Center of Public Studies down here in Santiago. My research topics are basically social policy, civil society, and decentralization. I did my PhD long time ago at the LSE, at the London School of Economics, and I think the work we do at the Center of Public Policy at Catholic University is very much a think tank within the university. Sometimes we like to call ourselves as do tank sometimes. We want to implement ideas, to push our ideas to become policies. So we are a mixture of a think tank and a do tank.
Great. Before we start with this relaxed conversation of how our two countries and regions went through change and what was the role for think tanks, I would want to invite you who are currently not on the stage to introduce yourself in a chat by saying your name, where you're based, and if you can choose from 3 options, whether the country that you live in or that you primarily work in is a democracy. So option A, it is democracy. Option B, it's a questionable democracy, whatever that means, whatever attribute you want to put next to democracy. And C, you are no longer living in democracy. So if you could just write in a chat so that we know which parts of the globe and which parts of political context and experiences do you bring to this session. So A, democracy, B, questionable democracy, and C, not democracy. The plan for today is that Ignacio and I try to go back in the past and get some lessons from the experiences of our countries and organizations in how it is to live in undemocratic system, and then what are the roles that think tanks can play in closed political systems during transition and formally in democracy or in the current unstable environments of democracy. And I think Chile is a really good example since it was a country under 13 years of military dictatorship, right, of General Pinochet. And before we go to think tanks, I want to ask Ignacio, how was it to live in dictatorship? How would you explain to those who didn't follow developments at that time or do not remember or haven't watched the brilliant movie like Missing from 1982 that describes some of the events from your past?
Well, it was a very hard time. I was a young person at that time, so I was not very much involved in politics or social movements at that time. For 17 years, political parties were forbidden, the press was very much controlled, and we've got a big number of human rights violations, especially at the beginning of the dictatorship. This is mid-70s, and the end of the 70s. And the other thing that I guess it's kind of special in the case of Chile is that this military dictatorship introduced a very important change in policy, changing Chile into a market-oriented economy. This was a right-wing dictatorship. So that produced huge unemployment at the beginning. So we not only had military repression, if I can say that, but we also had lots of economic constraints because the economy itself had to readapt, from an economy that was very much based on production for the country to an export economy, and that produced lots of jobs that were lost. So the environment was very, very complicated. Mm-hmm. I guess, I don't know, Sonja, if I can go further, but I guess related to our topic, mm-hmm. An important thing that because I had the same as you, I have been working for a while in the topic of civil society, and one of the main problems you've got at that time is that most think tanks or civil society organizations were needed to have a state acknowledgement and as a foundation. And that process was through the Ministry of Justice. And the Ministry of Justice that at that time was managed by the military dictatorship, review your status, your objectives, the mission, etc. It was very hard to obtain a legal recognition, and that means that for many think tanks or civil society organizations, to obtain funds, foreign funds, was complex. You got no legal recognitions, you cannot open a bank account, you cannot rent a house to operate, you cannot, you are not a legal person, so I can go further if you want. Ways that people organize to avoid that complex problem, okay? But this was one of the big problems that think tanks and civil society organizations have to face at that time.
Mm-hmm. So just to link to our audience, from what I saw in the chat, most of people who are with us are either based in democracies like Germany or US, but working in countries which have problems. And we have a colleague from Kenya, Jessica, who lives in questionable democracy, as it is Serbia now, but nobody here, at least now, is not experiencing anything close to what you described. And this is a very violent, repressive regime and very restrictive environment where even registration was questionable. If I may add, situation in Serbia during our authoritarian period was a bit less violent at home. The problem was that the country unofficially took part in wars in the region. So there was a draft and a mobilization and refugees, but the similar restrictions. So my first organization, student organization that I helped establish, had to wait for almost a year to get a registration from Ministry of Interior. So the ministry in charge of policing, again, security related, to say whether you can organize debates at university. So very basic obstacles to start getting engaged. But maybe we can move and see how this kind of obstacle was overcome, and especially because I've read that despite these restrictions in Chile during the dictatorship, think tanks were established. and they have employed quite a significant number of people. So if you could explain how did this take place, and I'll share the first movie recommendation in a chat, this movie Missing that I mentioned about the dictatorship for those that want to follow up our discussion later on. So how did you overcome these obstacles?
I mean, there were two ways. One was through the Catholic Church, although the Catholic Church is an independent institution from government. The military dictatorship acknowledged its canonical recognition. Okay, so the Catholic Church was allowed to work. The military government didn't want to have with the Vatican. Okay, Catholic Church, a number of think tanks were created. Now a Center on Education, an Academy for Humanism, a research group for agricultural issues, etc., etc. So that was one way to avoid to obtaining legal recognition from the Ministry of Justice, is to be part of an umbrella organization of the Catholic Church. And of course, organizations were not devoted to spread the gospel, but they were very much think tanks dedicated to the topics, okay? And the other way to avoid was to create a business, okay? So a number of independent professionals created consulting businesses or service companies, if you want. So these were for-profit organizations that hired people to study, to do research, to do advocacy. I mean, the things that think tanks do. So this was the two ways to avoid the recognition of the state. For-profit organization, but in practice do studies and obtain funds from foreign aid. Okay, so that was the way to work. Okay, and the think tanks, I guess, because the public universities and most private universities, we've got at that time quite an number of Catholic universities, were very heavily monitored by the government, so their research agenda was very narrow, very constrained. So think tanks started to position themselves as independent actors to be able to criticize, to analyze the achievements or the failures of government from a technical perspective. I remember at that time academic or policy discussions about, I don't know, the rate of poverty in Chile, the measurement the government was doing was okay or not, etc., etc. And this was done through the think tanks organized under the umbrella of the Catholic Church or as businesses.
Mm-hmm. Ignacio, we lost your camera. I don't know if you turned it off.
I'm going to check this.
We can hear you. It's just we lost the picture. It's okay.
It's okay now?
The organizers say, yes, I can't see you, but I can hear you. So please continue.
No, this is what I just wanted to mention. I guess it's interesting to learn how think tanks in Serbia made their way to influence policy during your hard times as well.
Mm-hmm. There were not many think tanks during 90s, during the authoritarian period. And actually, it was a very different path to what you described. There were public intellectuals who established NGOs, so classical civil society organizations, either providing human rights, legal aid, or services. But some of them focused more on research, and especially, I think, important role was played in relation to the public opinion research that later helped the political opposition to create a campaign against our autocrat and dictator. And the other important role was creation of alternative educational system. It wasn't under the auspices of a church as in Chile, but literally the professors who refused to sign loyalty to the government of Milosevic established what they called alternative educational academic networks, so kind of parallel education program where they created the new generation of researchers and thinkers on concepts related to democracy. So I would say that in our case, it was more in classical civil society, and private sector and church did not play such an important role, but it was more kind of public intellectuals from running away from government academia or government-affiliated institutes being active through civil society. And if I can move further, because I see there is question already on how things changed, maybe we can start discussing how think tanks helped bring about democracy or transition. So what could they do in these difficult situations to contribute to democracy?
Well, I guess in the case of Chile, as I said, I don't have numbers, to be honest, but I'm pretty sure that we did have quite a number of think tanks at that time during were thinking future in agriculture, in human rights, in whatever, in all the topics. They were producing stuff, material, they were thinking, they were contributing to the future of society. And again, there is a very different situation, I guess, in the case of Chile, because in 1980, we had a plebiscite and we approved a new constitution, and that constitution created a schedule, a path to return to democracy in 1989. In 1989, we had a plebiscite in which we were asked to continue with the military government or not, and the military government lost that plebiscite. So Chile is very unique, I guess, to that extent, because the military dictatorship was overthrown through a pencil, through a vote. So the vote produced the new government. So what happened? Can I go further, Sonja? Because I don't want to take.
Please do. And we
what
will
happened
invite
was
from the audience also to join us soon. Yes.
Very unique, I guess, because we had this quite an important group of think tanks during the dictatorship. And what happened is that in 1990, when the new democratic government starts, two facts were very important simultaneously. One was the fall of the Berlin Wall, shifted aid flows to Chile because they redefined the beneficiaries of that aid. So Chile was no longer a beneficiary, if I can say it, of a foreign aid. Okay, and again, the other element that was very interesting is that most professional elites working at think tanks, especially think tanks on the left, they moved to the government. So the most prestigious researchers on think tanks, especially those links to the left, they became ministers, vice ministers, chief of state agencies, etc., etc. So many think tanks lost their know-how and their prestige because they moved to the government. Most of the people moved to the government. So it's very interesting because democracy somehow help to, if I can say it, to slow down the importance of think tanks, especially those on the left, okay, because the researchers, the most prestigious researchers, they went to government because they had no money at the other time from foreign aid, so the way to survive, and honestly, that was I guess they moved to government, okay? So this is very contradictory, but democracy is helped think tanks on the right to become more strong and more concerned about policy and advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Because they also have other type of funding, like domestic private funding.
Yes, and they got yes, of course, and they had no possibilities to join the government from the left coalition, you know. So this was kind of a natural process, but very interesting. What produced the effect of becoming democratic country, what produced on think tanks.
Mm-hmm. I saw that in audience we have people who are supporting organizations in other countries that are in difficult political circumstances, and I would love to invite if any of them want to join us on a stage by clicking a join button to tell us how do they judge whether it is possible to engage in a country and whether they actually believe that think tanks can make a change in undemocratic environment. If there is anyone willing to ask a question or give a comment, this would be a good opportunity. I have also shared two articles on this context that Ignacio has discussed. How was it to work in undemocratic period in Latin America, and then two from the latest annual review on South Africa. Mm-hmm. So we have a reminder that you need to click the blue button, share audio. Yes, Zorana is with us, so please.
Hello. Hello from sunny Berlin, where I'm working with the Open Society Foundations, an organization that has been supporting think tanks, I would say, for more than 10 years. And as Sonja knows, I'm also working on the countries in Western Balkans, including Serbia, and I'm monitoring the support that our foundation is giving to think tanks in Western Balkan countries. And a couple of things that I might share from this experience, some of them are covered in Sonja's recent article. I don't know, Sonja, if you provided the link to your article for the audience, it would be good for the audience to have a chance to read it. But I wanted to reflect on this question, how think tanks can contribute to democracy in the country, which suffered from authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. And one of the things that Ignacio already mentioned is this movement of people from think tanks to the government, and then after the regime change, back to think tanks. So we have seen a lot of these things happening in Western Balkan countries, either from academia to the government and then back to academia, or from think tanks to the government and then back to think tanks. Some people have went several times back and forward. And honestly, I think it is good. It is good that for a while you work on research and policy proposals and even on advocacy, and then you are in a position to help implementation of something which is evidence-based, which was done independently, meaning without pressures from the government or from outside. That's one thing which we have also noticed. The other thing is related to shrinking civic space during the authoritarian regimes, which make the life of think tanks very difficult in local circumstances. However, what we have seen that is very helpful, this is networking of think tanks across several countries in the same region. And this process of networking and joint research and policy projects among think tanks from several countries have proved to be good in a sense to strengthen the position of a think tank in not only local circumstances, but also to work abroad. The abroad meaning based outside of this region or couple of countries. In particular, we saw this in the process of the European integration, in opening up negotiations with certain countries where think tanks from the Balkans were working together to help two particular countries to open up negotiations, and these are Albania and North Macedonia most. Also, I think it is important to show that think tanks are working together through media. And here there is a huge issue of fighting disinformation and fighting fake news and supporting with evidence-based research proposals and ideas to fight the disinformation area. I'll stop there. I hope it is helpful for continuing our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoran. I think you brought us to today's situation. And if I may highlight this strategy that you shared with us, I would call it jumping up the scales. So you have problems at home. You know you would have problems getting funding only to do work in your home country. So this is what we did in the Balkans, made a regional partnership and then did the regional research, which was more attractive both to the international audience and funding, but also domestically. The comparison between the countries was a good trigger to create engagement and interest by local media and even policymakers. So I think this is very good strategy. But just to go back a bit, we've discussed transition and we've discussed dictatorship. And I wanted to highlight also that the research was different, at least in experience of Serbia. I think at early stages of dictatorship, it was enough to ask right questions and to explain the basic concepts, because being brave and saying it public and doing it again and again and creating an alliance that would support the change was more important than to have the most sophisticated research. And I just want to highlight that this public education role of think tanks plays a very important role in breaking the initial taboos and fear that exists around the difficult topics. So it is in that way maybe different to Chilean experience, where, if I understand right, Ignacio, think tanks were involved in very technical discussions on economy and public policy, and that was a way to escape the politics. And in case of Serbia, it was way closer to the politics and more openly as a political actors. And then only in transition, think tanks became more engaged with technical issues and how to build the change. And if I may add, no, please.
Would you say that in your case in Serbia, think tanks were the arms of political parties or something like that, or they were very close to political parties? Because in our case, during the dictatorship, I would say, although we had quite a number of think tanks that you would acknowledge themselves, their ideological point of view are not related formally to political parties. So I wonder what was the case in Serbia, to what extent think tanks were somehow the arms of political parties.
I would say that in Serbia, think tanks try to keep an arm's distance from political parties and to be perceived as impartial, although there was one particular group that started as a think tank and later turned into political party and branded itself as a party of experts. but that was only one group. Other think tanks were trying to keep this impartiality. But I would say that during the dictatorship, the relationships between opposition political parties, think tanks, independent media, trade unions was way closer. They were not part of the same. They didn't share the ideology, but they cooperated more closely. And I would say think tanks played also a role of convening spaces of dialogue. And this is something we can also read about in on Think Tank's annual review in an article of a colleague from South Africa, which also said that this was their role to bring the people from different groups during apartheid to discuss issues and to get to know each other. But if I may just give another example from South Africa, and I think it's a very important role of think tanks that we forget frequently, and it's more recent on the topic of state capture. It's actually think tanks and academics that came together and, as they said, connected the dots or pieces of evidence that were collected by investigative journalists, by different researchers, and put them in context to explain what was going on in South Africa, why was country going in a wrong direction, and how institutions and legislation was repurposed for private gain away from public goods. So from what I've read and from what I've discussed exactly on think tanks conferences with colleagues from South Africa, it's this report that I shared in chat, Betrayal of the Promise, that was kind of a breaking point in South Africa of putting together many different pieces of what was wrong during Zumba's government and explaining that this was a concept of state capture and, giving the vocabulary to other actors in civil society. What is wrong, what is not functioning, and what needs to change. So they introduce concepts like shadow state versus constitutional state, meaning the state that got privatized by a particular interest versus the division of powers, explaining what is state capture and so on. So I think that's very important role why we need thinking, even if we are not doing tanking or closing each other. I think think tanks can contribute with giving vocabulary, giving concepts, and connecting the dots and helping other actors then act on it. So what would you say, Ignacio, is currently situation with think tanks in Chile? I know Chile is considered a free Latin American country, so you are not autocracy. Whether it's functioning democracy or not, you can explain. But what's the role of think tanks? Are they staying more in technical issues? Do they engage with politics? How do they position themselves in relation to, for example, massive protests that we had the chance to follow in the news in 2019 that took place in Chile?
Yeah, I guess think tanks have that kind of technical position in Chile, and I have read a number of papers or reviews about, trying to explain what happened in Chile, but they think tanks are not engaged in social movements. Okay, what happened in Chile during this riots, protests, or whatever you name, this was not, think tanks were not involved on that. I guess most think tanks have been discussing and posing different theories to explain what happened, why we reached this stage or not. This is what think tanks have been doing regarding the protests, okay? So the protests, very much, I still do not know exactly, to be honest. This was very much a social movement, a people movement. So, we still do not know who organized, to be honest, okay? But I'm pretty sure think tanks were not behind this. Think tanks started to analyze the situation, and they started to think about this new situation. This is the role they have been playing. And of course, we are having now a constitutional change, and of course involved in providing ideas for the new constitution. We are going to elect the constitutional members in a couple of weeks from now, and I guess the think tanks will be very important in providing ideas to that process. But as I said, think tanks were not involved in the social movement itself.
Mm-hmm. It is a very interesting, I would say that this is a common situation in many countries. The think tanks are not actually used to engaging with social movements, but in some countries, at least in Serbia, some of think tanks, and that's I'm highlighting some, are working more and more with social movements, not to strategize their approach to change, but more to for example, collect evidence on what's going on in the field, or to help them define their demands and put it into kind of policy discourse and processes. So they act as an intermediary between the social movements and either national policymakers or abroad. And I would give a good example, my colleagues from North Macedonia, where a few years ago there was a massive scandal. It was discovered that the government has wiretapped tens of thousands of citizens, and there was international pressure, but the international community was reluctant to act, and it was think tanks that kind of formulated a stand on behalf of civil society that they would stop promoting EU integration if EU does not react more determined way, and then they helped create the priorities for change, so to formulate the policy changes, similar to what you described with constitution. We have a question from Andrea, and I would ask others to join with questions or comments, or if they want, they can join us as Zorana did by pressing the blue button at the stage and give comments on the role of think tanks and democracy at this stage. So while I'm waiting for your questions, Andrea asked, what can think tanks do if there are no political parties? Can you imagine such situation, Ignacio?
Well, to some extent, that is what happened in Chile during dictatorship, because political parties were forbidden. So think tanks were a place to gather together and discuss policy. I wouldn't say politics, but I would say policy. Okay, so I guess think tanks do have a role while political parties are forbidden. They are a room to channel the ideas, the problems, the thoughts of people, you know. So that is what happened in Chile during dictatorship, because political parties were forbidden. I guess they do have a role on that situation, on situations like that.
Yeah, so it seems this is a very interesting point that think tanks can organize discussions, but they can also engage with citizens, do public opinion polls, and these kind of issues are rarely forbidden. So they can formulate, and maybe the thing we haven't discussed is the role of think tanks in creating new elites. So educating new generations that might ask difficult questions or formulate policies.
Yeah, I mean, in Chile, the center I used to work, the think tank I used to work, they created one of the very first public opinion polls in Chile in the mid-80s, 1980s, and they that public opinion poll predicted that the military government was going to lose the plebiscite, and I guess that public opinion poll was very important for people to have hope about the outcomes, to position that it was possible to have a different outcome of this process. So in this case, that instrument, a public opinion pool, was very, very important for the setting of the future discussion.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a very important discussion, and maybe we can ask people in the audience to join us. How much think tanks should help other actors formulate political strategies? So not just offer policy solutions, but, for example, use this data from opinion polls to strategize about campaigns. I understand that Chilean think tanks have fed into creation of the campaign for this historical referendum or plebiscite that you described. But also how much think tanks should engage in a debate on values, on narratives. So how much think tanks should become political actors? I mean, they are political actors because they have a stand, but how close or far away from politics they should be?
I don't know. This is my view. I think think tanks should engage they must engage in advocacy, but think tanks are different from political parties, I would say. So it's very narrow. I mean, it's very difficult to define order between a think tank, an independent organization, and a political party. And we do have in Chile think tanks that are related very close to political parties. They are financed through political parties. And basically, you do not read you know that this is coming from, and if they're in a position or if they're in government, they're going to say what is obvious, you know. So I guess think tanks that are so much close to a political party, at the end they lose their independence and their credibility, you know. Still, there are lots of think tanks that we know they do have a philosophy and ideological view, but if they are too close to political parties, they lose their independency. And what happens to me, at least, is that I simply do not read those papers because, as I said, if they are in a position or in government, I know that they are going to follow the rules of the government or the opposition. So they lose power, they lose importance when they become too partisan.
I understand the point about being partisan, but I was more thinking in a sense, this is discussion we had, for example, should we engage in a discussion with government on changing the legislation when we know that the way they want to deploy this piece of legislation is actually to channel the sources into their hands, or, you know, to shrink the space. So they improve one or two articles and then they, you know, reverse or worsen other articles. So how much time we should spend in this kind of technical policy discussions, or how much we should engage in you know, giving evidence and calling for accountability of the people that are doing bad. So not on behalf of particular political actors, but how much think tanks should have this kind of voice, or should they stick only to kind of technical discussions and evidence? It would be great if we can also engage people in audience. I saw we have a quite knowledgeable group, both think tankers, researchers, and researchers of think tanks. Ms. Stone is here, and donors who are supporting think tanks. If any one of you want to join in our discussion on whether think tanks and how think tanks can help democracy or be engaged around democracy, it would be great if you would join us. How to understand that a think tank is too political? This was a question from Victoria.
This is a difficult question. I mean, I quite agree with you, Sonja. If a think tank that has an ideological perspective reach to the conclusion that some piece of legislation is bad or wrong, they should engage in policy discussion and do to the rules of the political party, okay, and they want to promote a candidate for a seat in parliament or the presidency, okay. So the border is not very clear, but I guess if they become too political, is that they take part in supporting people to have a seat on parliament, if they support a person, major or president of the republic, etc., etc. I guess this is too political, but I do agree with you, Sonja, that it's important, and this is what we try to do at the university I work. I was thinking about what happened in the area of education. We do have a think tank within our university in the area, and they were very pushy against government about some changes on the education, and I think that's fine. They did all the advocacy, and they meet people, etc., etc., to try to position their view about this regulation that is the educational system in Chile. So I don't know, too politically. Sorry, Victoria, you catch me. It's difficult to explain, but I guess if you become engaged in political campaigns, that is too political. Okay, you can criticize to a political program, I guess, but if you become part of a political campaign seeking for votes, I guess you have become too political. It's not very clear, the limit, anyway. I've got your point, Victoria.
It's also a battle of image. We might say that we are not political and that we are discussing analytical issues, but in a polarized environment, and many of our countries are very polarized, the autocrats would label you as a political actor because you are challenging them. So no matter that you are not part of any political party, you are not supporting any political party, the fact that you challenge the official view and that you challenge it in a public space, they label you as a political actor and want to label you as an opposition. But I see there are questions. I might ask Hans to join us on a stage and explain his comment instead of me retelling it. And we have also Andrea's question about education of political parties, while Hans is climbing on this virtual stage. So Andrea's question was, what about education of political parties when they're weak or overly personalized? So whether think tanks can do something about it. I can share our experience. We had a very ambitious initiative called School on European Security, with the idea that we will educate young members of political parties on European security matters, so that within the political parties they can champion and understand these policy issues and champion the changes and help formulate the changes on our way to the EU. And we really got a very high ranking leadership of the youth of political parties, excellent students. They were very active throughout this year-long program. But the problem was that after they completed this year program, many of them were replaced within their parties because they were too critically thinking. They were not party soldiers. So despite their qualities, their interest and content, it didn't matter that much in political party whether you know your substance, but whether you're a good party soldier. So then we've realized that investing in the youth of political parties is not a good way of making a change that maybe we should invest in those that are leaders no matter to their affiliation. But Hans is with us. He managed to connect I guess from Georgia, right, Hans?
No, just from Germany. Sorry,
Germany.
it's all a bit improvised. I'm kind of staying over somewhere else. Thank you for the interesting discussion. I mean, and of course, in Germany, you have the interesting case of the political Stiftungen that in some ways sometimes also fashion themselves as think tanks. I mean, I wrote a long time ago, I wrote a piece on think tanks where I made the argument that think tanks are particularly convincing when they broadly ensure that everyone's better off. And the example I gave at the time was organ donation, because in most countries that have a successful transplant sector, there's a small number of countries, of course, a lot of people die on waiting lists, and a lot of hearts or kidneys get buried, or cremated. And so it's a classical policy problem where if you find the right solution, you push the Pareto optimum forward. And I realize it's a Weberian ideal type. Yeah, I mean, you're always going to take organs away that could be used in, for some other purposes. And I know it's a grim topic, but still. But I think that illustrates it to me. I'm less convinced by think tanks going straight out being redistributive, saying, oh, we're going to take away from this group because we're really, we want to give over that. Yes, that can even still make sense for everyone, that you're kind of redistributing somewhat, because we broadly believe that kind of societies work well if there's a bit, if maybe discrepancies are not too huge. But the idea is more widening a cake, I think. And again, that's where I think think tanks naturally are. I'm not making the argument that, you may not want to move more people to bicycles. You should never argue for more people moving on to bicycles because it's going to take away from people that sell cars. Yeah, that would be an extreme version. But again, I mean, that distinction policy that's broadly concerned with, can we get many, many people to be better off, versus we know it's a fixed game and it's just about how you're going to slice the cake. And we want to put it further over that. Entirely legitimate for parties. Think tanks, I think it gets a little bit into border zones.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand right, Hans, you are saying that particular type of changes that promote public good or not distribution are more likely to overcome challenges to democracy. So if think tanks can promote these kind of changes, they are more likely to push things forward and not divide or polarize more. Or if I misunderstood your point.
Yeah, and I mean, the presumption of think tanks is not that we're smarter in fighting our corner. Yeah, for that you have the David Axelrods and the Karl Roves of this world. You have the political consultants. You have the party benches. You have the machines, the political machines that are there. But somehow the presumption, I think, and again, I know there are people that will object to what I say because they do have a strong version where they think this should go in a particular political direction. But I do think think tanks are most in a kind of natural habitat and are most convincing if they're not about kind of running over one particular group because we have better arguments, but rather say, here's a solution that could work for lots of people. Mm-hmm. And again, that will always require a bit of change, yes, kind of making car dealers less well off when you put more people on bikes. But ultimately, the idea is traffic's not a bad example, because the people sitting in the traffic jams, they're also in dysfunctional equilibriums. And so I think, again, think tanks naturally are, when there's a dysfunctional equilibrium and you can overcome that, then I think that's, for me, an ideal type of something that should happen.
I think it depends quite a bit on particular political context and trajectory of country. I don't know, what would you say for Chile, Ignacio? And if I may call also Jessica to join us, I see she has a question.
Should I wait for or should I answer?
You can comment on Hans' contribution.
Yeah, I think what Hans has said it makes a lot of sense to me. I would say rather. I wouldn't say it depends on the content, on the context of the countries. I would say it depends on the area of policy you are discussing. But I guess think tanks do have a role in contestability. Nowadays, the government, America governments, they do not have all the knowledge, to be honest, to produce policy. Okay, even in this special policies about, I don't know, organ donations or things like that. Actually, a lot about a new law about organ. And we engage ourselves. We met the politicians. We presented to them our ideas, and at the end, this is one of got in Chile in producing a complete change in a law about organ donation and also about mental health. So I guess we do have a role in contestability, because governments sometimes they do not know what's going on in the rest of society.
Mm-hmm. We have Jessica from Kenya joining us also.
Yeah, I didn't mean to come here. I just asked a question, and I think Hans, in a sense, answered a part of it. I was asking whether think tanks have a place to partner with civil society, especially when they don't want to lose their neutrality, but want to put forward their ideas. And I think there's a bit of that is necessary, especially as they navigate the difficult political environments, especially for us in the South. It's interesting.
An example from Kenya.
Yes. So after the South Africa case of the report that they did about state capture in South Africa, Kenya, some of the Kenyan think tanks went ahead and did something similar, but because they knew they didn't have the power and the audience as much as the civil society does, they invited a lot of us to come to the room and were able to publicize and make news and hold the government to account based on their report, but the noise was not theirs. The noise was with the civil society and people behind the social movements. So them being on, when they're presenting, inviting us to come alongside them, it took away the pressure, in as much as, of course, the government would say, oh, this one is leftist or this one is, pro-opposition or pro-government. We would know that for sure the whole country got to know about that report. If they didn't have civil society in the room, which enjoys a lot of trust in Kenya, they would not have had that level of influence.
I think this is a very important point to make, Jessica, that think tanks might bring the master plan, but they don't have an engine to move it forward. They need other actors in civil society to mobilize a change, or to legitimize, as you gave example from Kenya, the change. Because think tanks are usually, as we heard in the introductory speech, part of a narrow group and don't enjoy that much trust as some other types of civil society actors. So I think it's a very important point that you made. And also Andrea has shared the report on think tanks did on cooperation between think tanks and social movements.
We as a think tank within the university, but I usually in all our with civil society organizations, and I guess we are kind of a ivory tower and society, and this is the role that think tanks should play in producing policy. And civil society, to have links with civil society is very, very important for think tanks to work together with practitioners and civil society. It's very, very important.
Thank you, Ignacio. I would just highlight again that yes, research is our hidden weapon in thinking and coming up with visions of change. But I think these kind of engagements with other actors and connections and nurturing communities, but also engagement with the stories about what's going on and what should be our societies like, this political role of think tanks, not the political party role, but political role of think tanks, I think also matter if we are to be actor on democracy. Thank you very much for your attention, and we can meet in a coffee room or during the networking.
Thank you so much, Sonja, and everybody here.